Hello, this will be part 6 in the series, The Science of Symbols, and we'll be taking a little detour, but it is connected because I got an interesting question from John Smith. Sorry, I missed it in the, but asking, so I was talking about 66, 40, especially 66 feet. I've been mentioning the Parthenon, the pyramid, but he was asking about the pi and phi. So you can pause there just to read the question, but we'll be looking at these and how they connect to these Hermeticists, but also to ancient architecture such as the Parthenon and the Great Pyramid, also the Pyramid of Meidum, and well, a few other ones as well, but just as an example. So throughout the series, I've been focusing on Athanasius Kircher and this particular diagram, touching on some others and how all this connects. And now in the Part 5, I started getting into how also New Jerusalem, the furlong, and Edmund Gunter, Queen Elizabeth I, and the standard weights and measures that we use now actually incorporate some very profound knowledge, and especially through the Gunter's chain of 66 feet, which is a standard, and the meaning of this has been lost. And so 66 feet. Also, this how it connects to John Dee, who was a professor of geometry, Francis Drake, the navigator, and of course the instruments of Edmund Gunter, such as the cross staff, which is 108 grains long, the quadrant, the chain, and these techniques of navigation, and how the furlong, so 660 feet. So as they describe New Jerusalem, 12,000 furlongs. Only really in horse racing do they still use a furlong. That's 10 Gunter's chain. And that, of course, will connect to New Jerusalem. But now we'll have a look at this another very important figure from the same site, just a little bit prior to Athanasius Kircher and Edmund Gunter, and that's Albrecht Dürer. Now, he's famous for many other things, but especially geometry. He was also a prolific illustrator and many other aspects. Now, this Melancholia 1 is one of his illustrations. Now, same thing. So she's holding the compass. We have the scales. We have the ladder, which is a reference to Jacob's ladder. The bell, which is a nice instrument reference to music. The sand, measuring time. Sorry, I forget the name of that instrument at the moment. It's just slipping my mind. But also the magic square, amongst other things, including these other important tools. Very symbolic. Now, Melancholia 1, I think it's currently housed in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It is like one of the most famous and most important Hermetic pieces of art, and it's still being interpreted, and people are trying to decipher it as well. Well, we've got quite a few connections there, so we come back. So Melancholia 1, Albrecht Dürer, Athanasius Kircher, and his illustration here, which I forget the name off the top of my head. But what do we have? Magic square. Magic square. This is a magic square of 34. You add up the numbers, any direction, you always get 34. That's one connection. Now, of course, we also have the compasses, and the compasses there. Now, I'll get into this Melancholia 1 later, because I have a lot to add in regards to that and how it connects to many, especially recent, but going back quite some time, some uploads that I've done, unpublished work. But you know, you got to serve your high priests, can't go against them. But Edmund Gunter, the chain, how does that connect to the Parthenon, to the Great Pyramid, and to these other works? Well, how does it connect to Sydney? How does it connect to Chicago? How does it connect to Einstein Tower, built for Albert Einstein, Potsdam, Germany, or the Louvre Pyramid in Paris by IMP, another this very important famous architect? Well, the chain and the information contained therein will all link together. And so, well, what's Einstein Tower? I did a video on this. You can just look up harmonics, Einstein Tower, I think the keyword, but that's 66 feet high, just like a surveyor's chain, a Gunter's chain. Now, in Chicago, the standard width of the streets is 66 feet. Some of the wider streets will be 132, and because of redevelopment, but if you look, you can just check it out, 66 feet wide. And same is the standard street width in Sydney, but pretty much across Australia. Now, that also applies to America and Canada as well. This is not just to these particular cities. Now, the street width in Sydney is 66 feet, and the carriageway is 42 feet wide, so 12 foot of sidewalk, or footpath as we say. Now, that applies to Chicago and to Sydney. Now, Chicago will have a 42 feet wide carriageway or a 12-foot sidewalk. Sometimes on some streets it will be 44 feet with a slightly less, but it is 42 feet for many of the streets, and they're 66 feet wide. And well, staying in Chicago, I mentioned in recent uploads going back quite some time, Anish Kapoor. He's this very important sculptor who gets his sculptures in the prime positions in America, Israel, England, such as the Selator Mittal just outside the Olympic Stadium there, which is 377 feet, a Fibonacci number, which will connect to phi and all these other things. Covered that earlier. That's 66 feet long and it's 33 feet high, 66 feet. So it's a chain as well, and one half of a chain. A Gunter's chain, but also a Rathbone chain is 33 feet high, or 2 rods. A Gunter's chain is 4 rods. A very important feature. Again, got into those. So who was responsible for the redesign of Chicago after the Great Fire? Daniel Burnham. He was a very important architect. He was also the leading figure, basically the founder of the City Beautiful movement of architecture, which had a profound effect in America, Canada, and Australia. And as I mentioned in many episodes as well, Lachlan Macquarie, that's a statue of Lachlan Macquarie looking down Macquarie Street in Sydney, which is 6 degrees off true north. But he was the one who put a precedent in where across Australia 66 feet wide streets, and with is pretty much a universal standard. Again, some redevelopment, redesign, but the original standard streets 66 feet wide. The actual carriageway or the roadway itself 42 feet. Now, Cloudgate in Chicago, so it's 42 feet wide, 66 feet long, but from the side 42 feet wide and 33 feet high. And we already saw it's 66 feet. There you go, 33 feet, half of that, or a Rathbone chain, which gives us a proportion of 14 to 11 on that side there. Now that will connect to, well, okay, so it's not just Sydney or Chicago that has these street measurements. It can be found in Winnipeg, in Manitoba, the United Series, well, USA, Australia, Canada, New Zealand as well. This is a standard. Building of the streets and incorporated by especially links to people and engineers, surveyors, just like George Washington, Lachlan Macquarie. It's very strong Masonic connections. Esoteric, the people who know their business, who are involved in the craft. And that will connect to Albrecht Dürer and Melancholia 1, because that is a 14 to 11 ratio. Same as well. Now this will connect to many other places, but again, Cloudgate, Chicago, 33 feet high, 66 feet long, 42 feet wide, giving us these proportions, which brings us back to Edmund Gunter and this very important system of measurement. So let's just focus on the street width. So the 66 feet wide, or 1 Gunter's chain, 42 feet carriageway, gives us a proportion of 11 for the whole street, including the sidewalk / footpath, and 7, so a 7 to 11 ratio from the whole street to just the road itself. And that's 7 to 11 fathom. You can also, using your measure, everything in this has got to do with measure. People have mentioned it, very important people. However, well, you got to go further and deeper, and what you find is a profound series of enormous, hugely important proportions, because now we have this 7 to 11 ratio. We just tilt it to the side. Now we get a 7 to 11 triangle, 7 to 11. And what's important about that? The Great Pyramid. That's the proportions of the Great Pyramid, 7 to 11. 11 over 7 is pi over 2. Not exactly, but using the, like going back to Archimedes, 7 over 11 pi over 2 is, as in the real world, it is a good applicable number. Now, on paper you want true phi, but in reality, if you can get a 7 to 11 pi over 2 ratio, you're doing spectacularly well in your engineering. The 14, so 7 to 11, that creates a 14 11 ratio when you do it like that. So it's, again, you just sort of halve it, and there you get the 14 to 11 ratio. And the where are we? Okay, so the Great Pyramid, the 7 to 11. Now, well, that half, now we get a right angled triangle. Right angled triangles being so important in Pythagorean theorem. We'll come back to that. Now we have a 14 to 11 ratio, matching Melancholia 1 from Malbec Durer, or Cloud Gate in Chicago, and also the streets of Chicago and Sydney and Winnipeg and so many others. It's again strong connections to City Beautiful, or even earlier, especially to Masons involved in the craft. So 14 to 11, it's all coincidence, of course. I mentioned the Louvre Pyramid by I.M. Pei. Well, that's the same ratio. The Louvre Pyramid is essentially, it's a scaled down version of the Great Pyramid, which gives us the same ratios and the same extended information. But I mentioned, well, the Parthenon again in previous episodes. Well, the columns of the Parthenon, so just the columns themselves, are in a ratio 11 to, and include the, now when you measure a column you should measure the whole height, but so we have the frieze and architrave portion on top, and then we have the column, which is a 3 to 11 ratio. 11 plus 3 is 14, so we have this same ratio happening in the Parthenon amongst so many other aspects, including the sacred numbers. Again, previous episode 5 I talked about Doric, Ionic, and how it's a unity point of measurement. So this is a standard. Now this is idealized measures of a pyramid. I've done many other videos in detail on the actual measures, but this is a good simplification. 144 Egyptian royal cubits base and 280 high, which gives us these pi and phi proportions. Now in regards to how do you, well, it connects to all these things, and so we can simplify that again to a 7 to 11 ratio. There we see 7 to 11, pi over 2, 11 over 7. Not exact pi, I must state again, but in real world engineering, again, if you can get this rate, if you can get pi to that level of accuracy, you're doing enormous, spectacularly well. Which brings us back to the pyramid. So if you look at the pyramid in 2 dimensions as a triangle, you get pi over 2, but here's the big mistake that so many have made, it keeps getting repeated. The pyramid is not a triangle, it's a pyramid, it's a 3-dimensional object. We need to observe it as a 3-dimensional object, and now we get 22 over 7, or the pi as defined by Archimedes. We have, so the pyramid's 3-dimensional, not 2-dimensional, and of course with that we can abandon 43,200. We can use a pendulum to give us the, as shown in the episode 5, how the pendulum will give us 1 Egyptian royal cubit the second, 86,400 seconds per day. You look at the pyramid as a 3-dimensional object, and what do you get? You get the actual size and circumference of the Earth. You don't need to use half measures. Because the Earth is not a half sphere; it's a full, it's a globe, not a half globe. And so, yeah. And anyway, eventually this will have to be rewritten, whatever they say. Got to hold on to those high priests. You can't go against the narrative. Even the alternative narrative is a religion in itself. And so 11 over 7. Now we bring in back earlier episodes. I mentioned Pythagorean theorem, which we can find in the many pyramids, which musical proportions and all this stuff that goes in. We can find all of that there. Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. We need a right angled triangle to do that. Now we have this 11 to 14 right angled triangle. So 11 to 14, what is x? Use Pythagorean theorem, we get that, and there we get, so that's a square root of 317, so that's 17.804499, etc. Now we can simplify that to make the half base 1. We get a very close approximate of the square root of phi, and there we get a very good approximate of phi, the golden section, the divine proportion, 1.618033, etc. Very, very close. Again, I've done, Alan Green has done other ones as well to show if you use the actual measures of the pyramid rather than focusing on idealized measures, you actually get perfect phi. So you can actually, the pyramid itself is better than these proportions. These are just idealized proportions like 432 and a lot of this other stuff. Just hasn't been improved upon, and that needs to change. Okay, so we see these Hermeticists, ancient architecture, the golden ratio, beautiful math, magic squares, the Freemasonic traditions, esoteric traditions, construction, measurable, testable, verifiable evidence. If proof's a hard word, let's just call it some very extraordinary coincidental evidence at the very least, and how all these things, previous episodes cover these things in detail, and I need to water them down. Here's another extraordinary, so circling the square, this very, amongst the so-called impossible geometric questions in regards to the compass and straight edge. So even the pyramid itself, Stonehenge, other places as well, incorporate the squaring the circle. At least it's a excellent approximation of this very important geometric information, knowledge question. And that itself also incorporates the size of the Earth to the Moon. Now the Moon is 27.3% the size of the Earth, and that in itself will, through the eclipse and the Sun, the Moon, the Earth, and the stars, will lead to again an extraordinary set of astronomical coincidences, the cosmos, and all of these other aspects. Now, however, again, we need to look at the pyramid as a three-dimensional object, because a pyramid is three-dimensional, a triangle is two-dimensional. If you look at it, if you move beyond the two-dimensional, you get to the three-dimensional, a higher dimension, and that in itself will provide better, much more profound knowledge, which can be incorporated into so many ancient structures, Hermetic traditions, and still the basis of science as we know them now. And of course, that three-dimensional, so you got the size of the Earth and Moon. Well, you also get the Earth itself. Once you abandon 43,200, and you see how the cubit, the second, the meter, the pendulum, the Earth, and all these other aspects come together under this much superior, much more elegant system. And back to Cloud Gate in Chicago, which is that, mentioned the street width, 42 feet wide. Well, I'll put the link in the description to a video I put up quite some time ago where J.J. Abrams and the hidden Hermetic themes, which incorporate 42, for instance, 42, and how that lottery adds up to 108, how 108 is also found in Cloud Gate in Chicago on many aspects. So the omphalos, or the navel underneath, which is 108 palms high, and 42 feet wide, which converts to this Cremona scar, which has been essentially lost from modern history, but that converts to 108 and 432. So we see these numbers, 50, so 168 hours per week, 504, connected to Plato's number, and all this, emerging from 42, and 144 and 432, all these essential Hermetic numbers, and we don't need to water it down and pirate. You're a pirate, mate. Even people have got their heads up on you. Now going back to J.J. Abrams and Lost and the theme, well, for instance, in the multiple references to 108, of course, in this show. And well, what do we have? 108 questions. What's question 42? Enkidu's friend, Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which incorporates the numbers 108, 432, 864, and all these harmonic numbers in there as well. 42, 42, 108, 432. They're all in there. At least don't water it down. If you're going to rip off properly. And why is it important for 42 in regards to the Hermetic traditions? Well, Hermes Trismegistus, 42 books. The Kabbalist tradition, 42 generations before Jesus. In Vermont, ancient Egyptian, 42 questions. The sum of a magic cube, magic squares. Now we look at magic cubes. The 3 times 3 times 3 is 42. 42 again in the Bible, and the Book of the Dead, spell 125. 125, where you mentioned there's a measuring cord, the plumb, and the scales. I know the names of these 42 gods. Now, 100. Now we go back to, well, we have the fishes, and so I meant that connects to 153, as in 153 fishes. But we also have 108 mentioned in Fringe and Lost and these other J.J. Abrams works. But what do we have there? Also 42. And well, what do you got? What do you see? What do you see? It's there. And it's mentioned Belgium port, Ghent. Isn't that interesting? 40, no, yeah, New York Times crossword. Anyway, 42, 108, all these systems of measurement and proportion, the golden ratio, all come together in the Great Pyramid, in the Parthenon, and yeah, so original stuff here, taking it way, way beyond the next step. Now go back to the pyramid. If you look at it in 3 dimensions, usually it's looked as a triangle, but this corner angle, so it's, well, what's the angle of this corner? Well, in using idealized measures, it comes up to 41.99 degrees. Again, if you look at it as if you use the actual measures, not the idealized ones, because each side of a pyramid has a slight variation, which means you get perfect pi and perfect phi in the pyramid, as well as this 42-degree angle, which connects back to these other guys, which are dropping it in plain sight. And they don't. Let's not water it down. You know who you are. I'll put a link in the description to this video where I go into, you know, again, just skimming the surface in there. I've done a whole series on this original stuff. I don't need to praise the dudes and to pirate other people's stuff. But what do we have? We have much more closer aspects of phi through measures, angles, proportions. It's all in there. Got to abandon 43,200. It's 86,400. 3-dimensional thinking, higher dimensions of thinking. Now back to, so for instance, in Fringe and J.J. Abrams and I did a series on phi and how it's embedded in other Hollywood shows. But 108, 72 degrees, how they're embedded in there. They bring us back to the the golden ratio, the divine proportion, which of course is embedded in so much of ancient architecture, Hermetic traditions, and up to the modern age, and which will all connect back to episodes, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and what do we get? Meters per second, the Egyptian royal cubit, again embedded in not just the Great Pyramid, but other pyramids around there. Also the New Jerusalem, the Epic of Gilgamesh. If you just got to look up, they describe in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it describes the preserver of life, or the Ark of Utnapishtim, which also incorporates Columba, the raven and the swallow. And well, these essential numbers keep emerging again and again and again. I've covered these in detail going back quite some time. And yeah, meters, seconds, cubits, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, ancient units of measure, always in these sacred temples, always coming back to the same sacred set of numbers. And of course time, proportion, measurement, the pyramid, and the work of Kircher, Durer, and so many of these other Hermeticists, and it will get into alchemy and these other aspects of it as well. And that just brings, so that brings us back to the original, you know, how do these, how can you find these proportions of pi and phi in there? Back to the original question by John Smith. And here we can use testable, verifiable, measurable stuff, many systems of measure and how they all merge together, rather than just thinking miles or inches. It's profound. It goes to Cremona, Doric, Ionic systems of measure. It brings us musical knowledge, astronomical knowledge, architectural, geometry, and it's all measured in there. It can all be tested. It can be measured, and yeah, and also other aspects of it as well. So Parthenon, Great Pyramid, all these guys, these systems of measure. Probably your street that you live on, if you're in Australia, America, Canada, or New Zealand, you're living on a 66 feet wide street. Your memorials, the churches and other things will have this 33, 66, 99 feet system embedded into them, and goes back centuries, goes back millennia. And again, it's a system, it's a verifiable system. So pi, phi, the pyramids, Hermeticists, the same emblems, the same symbols, and you saw it, or you've probably seen it. You should have seen it here first anyway, yeah, but now there's a bit of a pirate, bit of a shadow, who's, yeah, pirating stuff, and yeah, just because I debunked some of his rubbish, he can't bring himself to admit to it, and so good on you, Jimmy. We see you. Have a good one.